playing Siberian True, which is on close to the Edge album.
Yeah.
And, well, I'd already been playing a bunch of stuff like that with my band in the countryside in England, which we'll get to later. And I just... Eddie said, well, Alan can play drums if you want to rehearse a bit more. And they all said, well, okay. And so I just jumped in and started playing Siberian True with them. And I guess they liked what I was doing because I fit straight in and played the song.
It came obvious to me, I don't know, maybe end of January or February, that it would take more time for me to get back, to my normal self and in condition. And honestly, there was nothing that I could see that gave me a hint that I would be ready to go back on the road.
Okay.
In April, and that's when I spoke to the guys in the band and said, listen, there might be a problem for April. I think I might need more time. And at the same time, I said, listen, time is precious. Last time your singer had problems, you decided to move on because you had waited long enough, and I don't expect you to wait for me. I don't expect you to wait for me not knowing how long it's going to take me to come back to health. And so I said, I expect you to take whatever necessary actions for your band to continue and not just sit there and wait for me. So it was decided that somebody would fill in for the spring tour to give me more time to recuperate. When everybody accepted that, I said, listen, if you have somebody there that is doing a good job, that the fans like it, that the fans like and that you like and all, I would expect you to go on with that person. It was the band that recorded Drama.
Yeah.
But I was doing the vocals, but otherwise you're absolutely right. It was the Drama lineup that did that album. Yeah, he produced it. I mean, I know that there's some backing vocal tracks of his in the mix, far in the mixes.
Yeah.
in certain places, because there are tracks there that I didn't record.
Right, okay.
So I think he added some stuff there, which is great. But the voice, I mean, I did all the vocal tracks on there, all the lead vocal tracks.
Yeah.
No doubt about that. It really started being a problem just around the time I saw you in Manchester.
Yeah.
I was, my health wasn't all that great. Stomach problems, and it started in the UK. We started, I believe, in Birmingham.
Yeah.
At that time, and right then, it had nothing to do with my presence in the UK, mind you, but I really started, not to feel so well, and then, unfortunately, the touring is so demanding that I kind of went into my reserves, so to speak.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, 3 shows before the end of the tour, I had to pull the plug. I really couldn't do it anymore. Things were going worse and worse for me, and I needed to step out, and I felt that I needed to put myself back together and fix whatever the problem was.
It was big. It was another summer tour, and I think I was happy to do it. Yeah, happy enough to try anyway. But I think it got a little farcical. I remember being slightly astonished, even me, I thought I knew most things about the music business, but I remember we'd done very well in Philadelphia early on, as we always did, with 20,000 people going berserk, and it was just great. And they obviously got what they wanted. And we went round, did another 6 months somewhere else, and then there was going to be a sort of a second leg on the tour involving another visit back to Philadelphia, maybe New York. And I naively said, "Oh, this would be great because now we can play them some other music as well, And I realized that you're so tied into a show that even swapping the order of the music around is all but impossible because it requires, lighting plots and different this and different that, and different programming for this guy and that guy. It's utterly impossible once you are encased in the tombstone of a kind of tour. It's like a lead-lined coffin. There's nothing you can do with it. Once you've built it, you can't put tune 2 where tune 3 was, well, Yes couldn't. Other groups can, quite possibly. And they must do, otherwise they go crazy. But the sheer repetition for me, after a while, is just too much. And I remembered, why I didn't like being in those groups at all after a while. It's nothing like Yes in the 70s, really. And the principal way of creating it, that is that we all sat in a room in the 70s, he very wisely had not adopted that policy. And under his strict own personal supervision, he'd done half an album. What he needed, what he wanted, and what he thought he would like is for people like me and Rick Wakeman and Steve Howe to sprinkle our fairy dust, such as that might be, on what he'd done and bring it to life. We did that, and it was possible to do that because John had already taken all the key musical decisions. The compositions were effectively there.
Yeah.
So people like me were replacing drum machines in my own style.
Well, Tomato was an interesting album because once again, that had a variety of places that the music was coming from, and we were all writing and obviously trying to get our bits on the album. And there's release, which is almost our tipping our hat to punk. Really, it's a very aggressive, punkily played type song, even though it's kind of musical as well, but definitely it's got that element about it. And then there was Future Times, which is kind of cool, and it's got me playing like Neutron bass with effects and stuff all over the place, and Steve Howe and Rick Wakeman both saying who could play more notes in the bar than the other one, most of the time. And, it was like, who's that? Well, that was also to do with the fact that at that time John had started to come into the studio for the first time and whack down the chords and play along on his acoustic guitar with the band, which made Steve and Rick want to just play lead stuff all the time. So, of course, then John would go, just take my guitar out now. And so there'd be this big hole in the middle. And it would just be me and Alan with some guys fluttering away up the top. But, in a way, it was a kind of an invention in itself at that. Those tracks are interesting to listen back to. And, of course, one of the best songs that I ever wrote, Onward, which was a simple song I wrote around that time, was on that album. And I was very happy with that. And once again, Andrew Jackman did an arrangement on that.
Okay.
So the chap who did the orchestration on Fish Out of Water. And as he did pop in and out of Yes history over the years and do odd little things with us. What happened was at the end of the Sins illustrious career, I ran into these guys. Clive Bailey was the guitar player, and I really can't remember the drummer's name, which is not very good of me, but he'll probably come back. And they also had a bass player. They had a three-piece band, and they were largely expressionistic kind of players in that flower power kind of way, where the actual level of musicianship wasn't terrific, but they had a lot of ideas, especially Clive, who was a good ideas man, not much of a guitar player, but a good ideas guy. So I just kind of hooked up with them. It was around that time when people were experimenting with all kinds of, drugs and music, and we played at all the UFO, Middle Earth, and all the clubs that were, around central London, that which were places to go and have a jolly good time. What happened then was that during the course of playing around with them, and I never was really sure whether it was seriously going anywhere. We played a few colleges, and we did a half an hour long version of Light My Fire to end the show, and with an interminably long guitar solo. But I met John Anson at towards the end, and John actually came along and sang with Mabel Greer's Toy Shop at a couple of shows. And what happened was that that was really the beginnings of Yes, and the drummer fell by the wayside at a certain point, and Clive Bailey was involved with some of the writing of the songs that were on the first Yes album, Beyond and Before being one. And during the course of rehearsals for the early Yes rehearsals, Peter Banks came in, and who'd been in The Sin, and came in and took over the guitar playing from Clive Bailey. There's a tenuous link between the three bands. But it's hard to say it was a very serious project or not. No, it was a lot of having fun involved in that band. As we know, Rick had been in and out of Yes, and as he continues to this day to sort of do these away missions, as they call them in Star Trek, and he tends to gravitate backwards and forwards. And I guess Jon also wanted to give that a go because he was, I believe at the time, was about to or did do a solo tour, and I guess he played I remember going to see him at the Albert Hall with his backing band, and I didn't quite know what to make of it really, but it was all sounded fine and everything, but it was just a bit odd to see. So obviously, what the bottom line of that is that both those two guys obviously felt the need to go and do things outside of the band. So that left Alan and Steve and myself, and we'd already started rehearsing for the drama album, or that wasn't called that then. We'd just been rehearsing and we had ideas for tunes. And what actually happened was that Trevor Horn and Jeff Downes had hooked up with Brian Lane, who was our manager at the time, mainly because they were both big Yes fans, and both become hugely successful with Video Killed the Radio Star. In fact, the biggest selling single ever worldwide, I think, or in the charts for the longest amount of weeks. And so, of course, Brian lucked out because they loved Yes as musicians, and they ended up in our office just about the same time. So I just was in the office one day. I said, well, you play keyboards, you sing, and obviously you know how to write a hit. You want to come and join the band? And of course, I had a tough job selling it to Steve Howe and Alan White as well, that this was a concept. And then I also had the job of selling it to Jill Sinclair, who was kind of Trevor's counterpart and his manager to an extent. And, I had to persuade her that this would be good for Trevor to come and do. So there was a lot of work involved in pulling that lineup together. But as you say, the actual album came out pretty good, especially as once again we were up against a big time schedule. And there were tours that were already booked. In the States, there was 4 sold-out nights at Madison Square Garden in a row. That people thought that it was when Jon and Rick were still in the band, the tickets had been sold. So it was like we had to make this album and get the band up to speed enough to be able to go and play to the expectancy of the fans. And it was a lot of long nights and a lot of lack of sleep during that period, but we did manage to pull it off, and as you say, drama has a quality about it that stands the test of time. I think we were definitely pushing what we probably didn't realise at the time is that we already had established in people's hearts some favourite piece of music of theirs, whereas our focus, and especially Jon's, I don't think he'd mind me saying, was more focused on, well, okay, now the next piece of art. Let's do it. Let's paint the next portrait in a way. We don't have to paint the portrait we painted last year again, or even, So we were acting more as organic artists, trying to always do something new, and thinking that people would want to just see our new product. But of course, music doesn't work like that. People get attached to pieces of music, and it was always a lot of controversy within the band as well as within the audiences, I think, about how wise it was to do 4 sides of topographic oceans as the whole as the whole tour opening with Close to the Edge. As the warm-up. It was like, 5 25-minute long pieces of music, and I did quite often catch glimpses of people nodding off in the audience around side 3, of Topographic Oceans. So we were definitely trying to do a cerebral type of rock show as opposed to a bodily functional kind of dance type excitement and celebration of music from that point of view. We were definitely, I suppose, trying to appeal to people's heads.
First of all, record companies hated it because they weren't getting the revenue, and anything that was away from the norm was very unhealthy, the managers would say, and the record companies would say. You shouldn't be doing that, they would say. And the more they said it, the more I wanted to do it. So it's cool, you know. I just wanted to go and... It's like in the middle of the 70s, I got approached to do a piece of music for the Scottish Ballet along with Ian Anderson. And I said yes. Did my manager come to see it at Sadler's Wells? No, because he was the manager of Yes. What's he want to come and see what I'm doing for? Forgetting that I'm part of the band, you know. So in some ways, your survival is up to yourself and not up to anybody else out there at all. So what you do and what you go for, as long as you're pushed by music, you'll be okay.
Well, it was a strange situation because at the time, I'd always worked in music, but I'd always worked in it on a sort of part-time basis. I got into music full-time for periods, and I'd had lots of commission work coming, and then when there wasn't lots of commission work, I would go back and do a job. And at that time, I was working in an IT department and working in web development. I qualified as a graphic design artist in my teenage years. And I quit my job. I got the job. They said divorce starting in June or whatever. So I quit my job and I was working my notice. And I think I had like 2 or 3 days left until, I was due to leave the job totally. And John just sent me an email and said, I'm sick. It's not going to happen, sort of thing. And I sort of went, oh, okay. What do I do now? And my house was on the market. My whole life had been sort of turned around to join Yes, because my wife and I had a young son, and she wanted to be close to her parents if I was going to be travelling around the world, and we decided to move house so she could be closer to her family. We sort of amended our whole life at work. And then suddenly this email came out of the blue, and it was like, oh, all right then, what do we do now then? We sort of sat down one night and just thought, right, well, we can't sell the house and I can't leave the job. And so I ended up sort of trying to put everything back together. And then about 3 months later, I got phoned up by Steve again. He said, look, it's not announced yet, but we've got somebody else we're going to use instead of John. Do you want to still be involved? And I sort of thought, well, yeah, I've made so many sacrifices so far to do it. I still want to be involved in it. It's still a fantastic opportunity. And so we sort of switched everything back on again and did the same thing again. And I was quite pleased when I got to that first rehearsal and it was actually happening. I must be honest.
Well, I called it I in the first place because it's the story of life. But of course, I couldn't call it the story of life for some reason. I had a vision one day of that logo, and I did some research on it, and it appears that that logo actually corresponds to the 9th letter of the Etruscan alphabet, which was an ancient civilization as we know it, or we don't know it maybe, but at least I did some research on it. I'd called it I, and I wanted in this conceptual album to describe all the situations that one individual has to go throughout his or her life, as in playing a huge game and going into all kinds of situations. But of course now it would be called a reality show. It would be on TV all over the planet. Who knows, maybe it will. Maybe one of these days we'll create a reality show called I, So eventually it was called The Story of I because people couldn't make out what the logo represented when the cover came out, and the record company said, but you can't just call it what, By the way, do you remember Prince? Prince did that years and years later, and well, I was the first one to do that anyway. So I was probably also one of the very first musicians to coin world music, because I had the synthesizers, the guitarists, the percussionists, and all kinds of different array of effects and keyboards and so on. But I also had done many recordings before in the 60s with some percussionists in Africa, which probably will resurface one day. I've never been able to release that. The Story of I was really a very interesting album to do, and I had a team of, like I said, extraordinary players It took about 4 months, and I think we recorded side A in about 10 days and side B in about 2 weeks with a different drummer, Andy Newmark, who used to play with Sly and the Family Stone and so on. The rest was taken, of course, by the vocals, the arrangements of all the keyboards, the orchestrations, and, of course, the editing and the fitting all together of it to make the album flow from one piece to the next. I understand that nowadays some jazz musicians and some other recording artists are coming up with concept album with what they call a complete hour of music or flowing, from A to Z as well. But I have to say that I was probably one of the very first, at least solo artists, to do such a complicated album and such a production. And make it flow from A to Z. There are 14 pieces on this album, and if you put it on the CD player now, you'll notice that everything flows really nicely. There had to be a split, however, at the time, because side A and side B were on vinyl, and however, the intention was to have one continuous piece of music, like life. Life's continuous. Or a film, definitely. But yeah, it's very interesting that after 30 years, this music is still as present as it was then. And I think it hasn't aged. Could we call it the presence of timelessness? I've played the whole album in the beginning of the 90s with the group and many years after, and we did some gigs in America. Now I'm playing some of this material with other musicians, and I even have done some new recordings of it. I discovered that the music of Story of I and the concept could actually become not only a stage production, of course, but I would like to play it more than one time, of course, because it involves so much logistics and rehearsals. It would be good to do a DVD of it too. To do a tour of it with some concerts would be fantastic. Also, I had always had the idea, since I've been involved at times in the film business via the music, for it to become a movie as a sort of futuristic science fiction production, or an animatronics production, or maybe a video game. Why not? The story really lends itself to so many different and interesting scenarios that it would be quite an exciting venture, and I really would love to see that happen. We were really extremely successful in '75, and all the concerts were sold out. It was a fantastic tour. After that, I took my keyboard engineer, Jean Ristori, who was the bass player originally in Main Horse, and that I had brought along with me as my keyboard tech in Yes. And after that 75 tour, we went down to South America. We went across the whole continent to Colombia, Bolivia, Peru, Chile, Argentina, and eventually we ended up in Brazil. And that's where I met some of the best musicians and some of the best percussionists on the planet. I decided to start recording with them immediately, and what was to become the backbone of the Story of I. I had such a fantastic time playing with them. I think for 3 days we recorded non-stop, and it was like a whole carnival, a whole fiesta in the months of August, which was actually the winter in Brazil. Anyway, the rest is history. We came back to Europe with the tapes from Brazil, and since we had about 3 to 4 months of free time, we decided to record the album there in Geneva. I invited some of the best musicians actually to play with me. I invited Jeff Berlin, and that was his first big gig, and the first time he played on a big production like that. He was fresh out of the Berklee School of Music, and he was only 22 at the time. That was the first time he was invited to play on an album. of that magnitude. And I also invited Alphonse Mouzon, who was a very successful drummer with the Larry Coryell band at the time. And also Ray Gomez was a very good friend of mine and an amazing guitarist, acoustic and electric guitarist. So we took time to record the story of I think about 4 months, and it was a fantastic experience. I don't regret any note or any minute of it. However, to answer your question, the beginning of your question, I wouldn't have minded recording another album with Yes during that time. Anyway, you were asking me if we knew or if we had made plans in advance to do solo albums while I was a member of Yes. And in 75, I think it was Steve who started, and he asked me to do some orchestrations and arrangements and to take part in the recording of what was going to become Beginnings, his first solo album. He had asked me to do a piece that would be like alla Vivaldi kind of thing. And for a little guitar solo that he had, a guitar piece that he had written he had recorded on a cassette. And he just gave me the cassette. There was a few notes, 3 notes repeated about 12 times. It was very succinct. And I did a whole arrangement and orchestration, of course, and I conducted the chamber orchestra. I played the harpsichord as well. And upon the result, I think he was really knocked out. He loved it, he loved it. That became the title piece for his album, Beginnings. I think later on, Chris asked me to participate in his whole solo album, also Fish Out of Water. And that's where I met Bill Bruford for the first time, because actually I had met Yes in 68 when they came to see us and hear us in Basel. And also in 1960, in 1969 at the Golden Rose TV Festival, where they were playing, and we were playing also as a feature. It was just in the beginning of 75, before the tour, that we started talking seriously about solo albums. My first one, my first solo album, The Story of I conceived during the tour of 75, and the story itself came when we were doing a big concert in Nashville. And for some reason, that's when the story kind of crystallized in my head. Well, from that first audition with Yes in North London, sometime in August 74, to the first concert, which was taking place only a very short few months after that, in America, I had to learn the content of 8 albums, really. Because technically there was 8, because Tales of Topographic Ocean was 2 albums, and Relayer, of course, made the 8th one. So some of the material for Relayer was somewhat already composed when I arrived, but I had to fit in my parts and also compose some of course, brand new parts, for Gates of Delirium and so forth, and of course, Sound Chase and so on. I used to spend nights, the whole night, every night, after the recording sessions, writing down my parts on big pieces of paper, big plans, and it was an unbelievable amount of work, because in order to master all this material, I had to remember not only everything, but I had to remember all the moves. And I had jumped from 7 keyboards to 14 keyboards, and although I knew some of the material because I had listened to it very intensively before, and I had a lot to learn.
It's like going through old photo albums or looking at school photos and wondering why you looked so silly and had such a silly hairstyle. And it's nostalgia. I mean, that's all it is, and it's nice to indulge on occasionally, but
you can't live in the past.
No,
obviously.
but once again, in retrospect, I mean, the album doesn't sound as bad as I thought it would be, because I've obviously heard the BBC things before. and all I used to listen for was the mistakes. You know, like, most musicians would do that. You know, when you finished your new CD, you know, you immediately think, well, I wish I could do that again. It'd sound much better. But now trying with, you know, with distance, it sounds like a bit of, you know, it's like dusting off an old scrapbook. And then I think, well, it's not so bad.
The idea for a double album, that was Tony Visconti. A&M were insistent, because everybody was using producers at the time, that it would be good for me to have a producer. And I said, fine, as long as it's somebody who understands me and understands music. And they were very happy with Tony Visconti. I'd worked with Tony, obviously, with Bowie and with Straubs. Good musician, really, really nice guy. And we recorded it on a mobile, which was done at my house in Switzerland, halfway up a mountain in the Alps, which was great fun. Although Tony, being an American, didn't quite understand that when the snow came where I lived up the Alps, it really came. And I said, look, you're going to have to get this truck down before the snow comes, which will be sort of November time. And when it starts coming, you know, trust me, it's not, oh, here's a little dribble and away we go. And he said, well, I'm sure we'll get some. So I said, no, it doesn't work quite like that. I said, and once it comes, you will not get this mobile down the mountain. And it came, 8 foot the first night of snow. And the only way to get it down, they actually airlifted it down in the end. It was the only way. It cost a fortune. But the album was fun. I mean, it was... there were some interesting sounds on that album. March of the Gladiators, I was always intrigued with the sounds that I got, because we're talking, you know, sort of late 70s, and there was a new digital kind of sound starting, which the Buggles were doing, you know, Trevor Hall was sort of, but there was also, it was the end of what I call a great analogue era, where there were some great analogue sounds that were never really used that much because of the sort of the arrival of digital. And I loved some of these analogue sounds that were the last of the set, I suppose. And a lot of them were used on this particular album. And we also did some fun things, which were a bit self-indulgent, but I'm still glad I did them. We wanted to have all different kinds of music on it. Tony wanted it to reflect all different kinds of music that I'd been involved with over the years. And one of the things that came up was trad jazz, because one of the first bands I ever had was a trad jazz band called Brother Wakeman and the Clergymen. I was 12, because I loved all the old Dixieland jazz and things. So he said, right, let's do a Dixieland track. I said, well, I've got a Dixieland band. He said, do it all on you know, the instruments that you've got. Now, it'd be very easy to do now with all the digital sampling and various things, but back in 1978 or whatever it was not that easy. So the track, which I think was called Half Holiday, was all done on very primitive analog keyboards at the time, and I was really pleased with how it turned out. I mean, 'cause it does sound very genuine. The other thing we did in the same breath was Tony wanted to do Rhapsody in Blue, and again doing it with the keyboards doing all of the parts. But as I say, again, today, very easy with all the sampling and various things. But back then it wasn't. It was a lot of single note playing, single line playing. We had a rhythm section which was 2 guys from New Zealand who Tony worked with a lot, who were super players, really, really nice. I have to say that a lot of the tracks musically on that album, if I'd have been in control of the album, if I'd been produced, they would never have been done. Rhapsody in Blue would never have been done. Half Holiday would never have been done. Woolly Woolly Tango would never have been done. Those kind. But having said that, when I listen to them back, I go, you know what, I'm really glad I did that, because sometimes it's very helpful for somebody else to say, hey, come on, do something a bit off the wall. It was an album that was liked much more on the continent than it was in the UK and America. For anybody who bothers to have a good look at the cover, believe it or not, that was halfway up the mountain in my back garden. I really loved the Earth Collection. It started in Brazil, and Pedro de Gavia, which has, of course, got lots and lots of UFO sightings and things. And then we went into America, and I started talking to people who were involved with UFOs and sightings. They're very sane, sensible people, a lot of them. Met the odd nutter, of course, but there's a lot of sane, sensible people. And so I started the album, No Earthly Connection. And there was a story. I wrote a storyboard first. And the story was based around the fact that we have a soul and we have a music soul. Because nobody really knows quite where music comes from. And when somebody is born, they're born with a music soul or whatever. And if they find it and use it, they can develop it to a certain stage. And when they die, it's then passed on to somebody else. And it's passed on at the stage you've taken it to, which is how music keeps developing. So it was the lifespan of the soul of music, really, which a certain person at A&M who remained nameless didn't get at all. The album they really didn't like, they didn't get. I was very, very fond of No Earthly Connection. My band at the time, they really did get it. They got it, and they understood it tremendously, which is why they played it all so well. And it was a lot of fun to do, that album. I remember, though, that it only at the time sold about 4.5 million. And A&M called my manager into an emergency meeting to discuss the album that they felt had flopped, which, when you look at sales today, is quite ridiculous, really. It was Ken Russell. I love working with Ken. I mean, Roger Daltrey was Liszt. Paul Nicholas was Wagner. Probably one of the strangest castings was Ringo Starr as the Pope, who arrived on a Dodgem car, which was quite interesting, and I was the god Thor. It was great fun to do. I mean, that's an unusual album because it is not the album that I originally put together from the film, because I always felt that film soundtracks let people down, because what they tended to get was a lot of little snippets of bits and pieces shoved together, and the main theme played 46 times. And so what I wanted to do with the Listomania album was turn it into a bit of a story, which is what I did. I turned a bit of a story. I extended some of the songs, some of the tracks, turned some of the small bits of music into proper pieces. And once again, somebody who will remain nameless at A&M said, "Don't like this." Now, A&M had some financial involvement in the film, so they had an awful lot of control. So they said, "Oh, we're going to remix the album and do it as we want to do it," which is what they did, and it got slated. It got absolutely slated, mainly for the reasons that I said to you. Said, why is it that soundtrack albums just have a little bit of this theme, a little bit of that, and don't have that? And I was really upset. But the one thing I did do, I mean, listening back to it, some of it's very good. I'm not saying it's all bad, but it was not forward-thinking as an album. What I did discover many years later was the original album that A&M had turned down, which we released on voice print as the real Listomania. And I rather imagine that when the albums are released separately, we'll probably stick those two together. But the Listomania album is quite collectible because the film has become a cult film. I mean, it absolutely floored people when it came out. The Liszt Society, I mean, I was on their hit list. I mean, the Liszt Society issued the equivalent of a fatwa against me. I mean, it was unbelievable. Radio 4 did a whole program, and the Liszt people, I mean, basically, if they could have knifed me on the spot, they would have done.
I can't imagine them threatening to do that to Roger Daltrey, though.
Well, believe it or not, they did. They sort of basically, they hated us all. And Ken Russell, as far as they were concerned, was the devil personified. Oh yeah, he was the devil. The irony is, as years went by, the Listomania film actually increased the popularity of Liszt. The film is now cult, It's not done Liszt or his music any harm whatsoever. And in fact, this year I'm going over to Slovakia to play in a concert celebrating the anniversary of Liszt's birth. So there you go. What goes around comes around. And I arrived there, and there was the Red Lion pub in Red Lion Square. And I went up to Melody Maker offices. Chris Welsh was there. And I said, "Hello, Chris." You know, he said, "Oh, hello." I said, "Just passing and just wondered if you fancied a drink." He went, "Oh, yeah, great." So we went down to Red Lion. And I didn't say, he said, "What are you up to?" I said, "Well, just putting together the concerts for King Arthur." He said, "Oh, fantastic. Where are they going to be?" I said, "I can't really say. It's all a bit hush-hush at the moment." He said, "Oh, come on, off the record, tell us." Now, off the record to any journalist, as you know, I went, all right, because it's you, Chris. And I said, "I'm going to do it at Wembley, at the Empire Pool," as it was called then. He said, "Well," I said, "on ice." He said, "On ice?" I said, "Yeah, building a castle in the middle. I'm having about 100 ice skaters around depicting all the scenes with the choir." And he went, "Wow." I went through the whole thing. I said, "Anyway, mum's the word." He went, "Absolutely." Came to the Thursday when the Melody Maker came out. It was on the Tuesday. There it was, front page, King Arthur on ice. And Brian Lane phoned me up. He went nuts. He went absolutely nuts. He said, "Have you any idea what this is going to cost? Will you ever learn?" Because, I mean, with the Journey to the Earth, I took a symphony orchestra around America, used every penny I'd earned from the album to do the tour. And I said, "It'll be great." He went, "Oh." So we sold 3 nights at Wembley. I had all these ice skates. I mean, ice skating wasn't even popular in the UK. So I shipped them all in from Eastern Europe and from Australia and all sorts of things. And what was interesting was that Brian sat me down with the accountant, David Masterton, and they said, "Right, you sell out 3 nights at Wembley Empire Pool." And they handed me a piece of paper. They said, "This is how much money you're going to lose selling every ticket." I went, "Okay, there you go." And they said, "And that will put you back to normal again. You keep doing this. You sell loads and loads of it, and you spend it on the concert." I went, "Yeah, there you go. But it'll be great fun, won't it?" And they went, "Well, you're completely barking." Now, the interesting thing was, up until about the time of the concert, I think Arthur had done about 2.5, 3 million at the time. That ended up doing 14 million as well. And a lot of it was down to the fact that even though we only ever did those 3 shows, it seemed like everywhere in the world that I went to, everybody knew about that show. There was photographs. It seemed to travel all around the world. And it became one of those concerts that there's a couple of things I found quite funny. Was that in magazines, when they have polls on best concert ever or biggest folly ever, it's always in the top 3 of both categories, which I find quite funny. And the other thing, I suppose, is that if I could have a quid for everybody who said that they were at one of those concerts, oh boy, I'd be a rich guy. And I will do it again. It will be done again, on ice. May the 18th, 1974, I had a house in Devon, and I was in the house actually on my own. And I decided, another long story, that musically, the direction that Yes were going in at the time, which was, following on from Tales from Topographic Oceans, and the relay stuff was starting to be put together, that it was going down a route that I couldn't contribute to. And music is about give and take, and you can't just take, you've got to be able to give. And I couldn't give anything to the direction that it was going in, so I decided, much as I didn't want to, that it was best for the band and best for me if I left. I mean, financially, it was a stupid decision because, Yes, we're booked to do like QPR, football ground, all sorts of things. And in fact, Brian Lane, who was the manager, said to me, "You're nuts. Swallow your ethical pride and do it. You'll make a lot of money." But I couldn't do it. And so I actually physically left on my birthday, which was May the 18th, 1971. And after I put the phone down from the Yes office, I was feeling very sad. Because even though I knew I'd done the right thing musically, ethically, I was sad because Yes meant such an awful lot to me. And then I got a call from Terry O'Neill at A&M Records saying, hey, great news, Journey to the Centre of the Earth, number one in the chart, the first A&M number one. I went, oh, great. And he went, you don't seem very happy. And I said, well, I've just handed him a notice with Yes, and it's just a bit of a strange day, and it's my birthday. And yeah, it was a weird one. And Catherine of Aragon had a different title initially when it was first recorded. It was called Handle with Care. And now there's a reason for that. It was always Catherine of Aragon, but it was called Handle with Care because I had to do the album over a period of about a year because I was working with Yes. And at that particular time, believe it or not, there were a lot of tapes being stolen from studios. And I recorded that one at Trident Studios, and they said to me that, okay, what's the track? I said, Catherine of Aragon. They said, no, to put on the box. And I said, what do you mean to put on the box? And they said, well, we always put ridiculous things on the boxes because we've had a lot of burglaries of stuff being nicked, and they'll look for names and faces and things. And they said, people know you're doing the Six Miles album, because there was a lot of bootlegging going on, especially in Holland. So stuff would suddenly appear out there. And so the first album I'd done with Yes was the Fragile album. So from Fragile came, Handle with Care, and it was down on the box as Handle with Care from the Joe Loss Orchestra, because I thought no one's going to nick that, and they didn't.
Well, we resented it somewhat because we thought it was time to have another, song like, there were big songs. There had been, Someone Left the Cake Out in the Rain, McCarthy Park. There had been long songs and there had been hits. So we felt the Roundabout could have been a hit like it is. But their wisdom was actually right, because at the time the radio may not have played such a long song from an unknown English band, but they did play Roundabout, and of course it charted and got to be number something. I don't know whether it was one, but it was high, and so was Fragile. So it hoisted us into the level that we like to think we'd grown already accustomed to, which was quite a lot of success. We wanted the best PA. He was at the time helping to design what were later called Roy boxes, I think, and S4s, and we were at a transition where the old kind of PA that we bought in England from Iron Butterfly for £5,000 was a three-way system with crossover and all that, and this was superior to anything any Wem or Marshall or anybody had as a PA. We had the best PA in England at that time. It was only suitable for smaller venues, but I guess we used it in the Albert Hall as well. RCA mix is just like a Joe Meek sort of studio, really, surprisingly. But big bins, W bins. But when we went to America, it had all been stylized and reinvented, and the W bins lay under the stage, and the horns flew in the air, and you had the mid-range. So it was all. And then Roy decided that this was too much. You had to have. So Roy was getting inventive, and he's always said it was a major opportunity for him to do Yes, because of our clout and our apparent style. It was good to say Yes, use Claire, as much as we said, well, God, you keep delivering all this stuff, and so he bent over backwards for us, and we still love Roy very much. The same with Michael Tate, who went from being our all-round sort of tech. He then moved to America. He's Australian, actually, and he created Tate Towers, which is one of the most successful stage and lighting systems in the world. Yeah, well, there's a sort of like mixed answer about that one, because his importance on the record was enormous, and we shared that production credit with him with great justification, because he did, but it was all done very naturally. In other words, he didn't feel set up for the job, he didn't feel under pressure, but he had the honesty and truth to be able to say to us, look, that's not good enough, let's do another one, or, it was better 3 times before. So he had good ears, and he had great skills at engineering, editing, generally, the flamboyance kind of came later. At first he was almost more like a boffin sort of guy, who worked on the engineering. You can imagine that isn't like being a rock guitarist. So, but along the way, his skills got helped to make us famous, and the sound that we had, that squashy, tight little sound with Bill's very
very jazzy drums and my very clean guitar compared to the bluesy finger baratos. And so we all brought a different creature to the table, but Eddie knew best how to get that mix.
Jon came over to the studio one day from Paris. He was working in Paris, heard the album and freaked and said, I really want it. Of course, Trevor had done the vocals on it.
Yeah.
Well, everything was complete. And Jon said, I really want to sing on this. And of course, the powers that be, management and record company, were only too happy because they saw yes. And so Jon came into the studio and redid the vocals, and it became yes, and huge.
I guess, I was obviously by far the youngest in the band, so the grueling side of it didn't really hit me. I'm sure it would today. It was over the top. It was, it was definitely, saliva dripping out the promoters' mouths, along with a bit of blood.
Yeah. With the tour being so big, the only thing that surprised me about that tour, there was a live video, but there was not a live album. And there was a sort of mini album which had some of the soundtrack from the video on there, and and it had the solos, 90125, 9012 live, the solos. Is that a regret not maybe capturing that show on a double live album, a la sort of kind of Yes songs or Yes shows or whatever? I think it was a bit of a missed opportunity, personally.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, if there was time and we could locate where the tapes are, I know they were a couple of analog 2 inches linked together, so it's not like it's not there. It could be done, but there's a couple of things. One of the biggest disappointments for me, or regrets for me, is I did a tour on my album Can't Look Away.
Yeah.
And there's an album because we recorded it, and
I have it.
The band was playing very well, and I'm just sorry there wasn't a video of that.
Well, the thing that I'm thinking really is that also from a business point of view, live albums are notoriously used as contract bargaining chips and also contractual fillers. So I'm quite surprised that the management didn't think along those lines as well.
I think possibly the reason with Yes why it didn't become an issue is because there was never the thing where we had to deliver whatever, say 6 albums in a certain period, and we had 2 to go, because the band was in such a state of disarray most of the time that nobody knew who the band was going to be, or if there was going to be one, from one day to the next, pretty much. Well, the thing about that album is here's how it happened. There was Anderson, Bruford, Wakeman, Howe were doing another album. I, out of the blue, get a call from Jon, and he leaves a message, if you've got any good songs, we're looking for some songs for AWH. And so I said, well, and I had Lift Me Up, which I thought was a Yesy kind of song. So I called Clive Davis, and I said, I just got a call from Jon, what's happening? And he said, we need a single, there's no singles on the record, it's not what we need it to be. If you've got a bunch of songs, especially we need is a hit single, and we need some other material. So I said, well, I've got a song, but to be honest, I don't want to give that song to Anderson, Bruford, Wakeman, and Howe. It's because it's something I want to do. I want to record the song. It's not like Love Will Find a Way, which I still feel a bit guilty because I did write it for Stevie.
Yeah.
But Lift Me Up was something I wrote for myself. So Clive heard the song, and I sent it to him anyway, and he said, this is the single, we've got to put this together. And that's when it became, well, look, why doesn't, all Steve Howe's parts, Steve was very unhappy apparently with the Anderson, Bruford, Wakeman, Howe thing, because the producer had replaced most of Steve's parts, and